I honestly thought that chapter of my life was over. When my phone lit up with Edward's name after almost 8 months of barely talking, I figured he wanted a favor. Maybe he needed help moving. Maybe he'd forgotten a password I set up for him years ago. Maybe he was calling to apologize for how everything had ended. I wasn't expecting him to say the one thing I'd promised myself I'd never hear again. Spencer, would you be my roommate again? For a few seconds, I just stared at my apartment wall, convinced I'd misheard him. You serious? Yeah. The same roommate thing that completely wrecked our friendship last time. A long silence filled the call before he answered. Yeah. I leaned back on my couch and laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. Edward had been my best friend since sophomore year of college. We met because he accidentally stole my backpack. Not kidding. We'd both bought the exact same black North Face bag, and after chemistry lab, he walked away carrying mine, while I spent 20 minutes accusing half the class of stealing it. He came sprinting across campus, looking completely embarrassed. Dude, I thought my laptop suddenly got heavier. You also thought your backpack magically changed keychains. I never pay attention. That pretty much summed him up. Edward was one of those effortlessly likable guys. 6'2", athletic without trying too hard, messy brown hair that somehow always looked intentional, and the kind of smile that convinced strangers to forgive him immediately. Meanwhile, I was the quieter one. I liked routines. Coffee every morning from the same cafe, same running trail, same grocery store. Predictability made life easier. Edward was the exact opposite. He'd wake up on Saturday and decide we should drive 3 hours to eat barbecue because somebody online said it was worth it. And somehow, I'd always end up going. After graduation, we couldn't afford apartments on our own, so sharing one seemed obvious. For almost 2 years, it was honestly the best time of my life. Movie nights, late-night takeout, arguing over whose turn it was to buy toilet paper, watching terrible reality shows, ironically, until we were actually invested. People constantly assumed we were brothers. Some even assumed we were dating. Edward would always laugh. Nope, just roommates. I'd laugh too, even though a small part of me wished the answer were different. Because there was one thing I'd never admitted to him. I was gay. And somewhere during those 2 years, I'd fallen hopelessly in love with my best friend. I never planned to tell him. He dated women, talked about women, complained about women. As far as I knew, there was nothing to tell. So I buried it. Pretty successfully, actually, until everything exploded. It happened because of one stupid misunderstanding. Edward had started seeing this girl named Melissa. She was nice enough, pretty, funny, but from the very beginning, she hated how close we were. You guys spend a lot of time together. We live together. I know, it's just, she never finished those sentences. She didn't have to. I knew exactly what she meant. She thought our friendship was weird. After a couple months, Edward naturally spent more time with her. I understood. That's what happens. People grow. Relationships change. But little things started disappearing. Friday movie nights, Sunday breakfasts, random conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning. Instead, I'd hear his bedroom door close while he FaceTimed Melissa for hours. It shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. Not because I wanted him all to myself, because I missed my best friend. One night he came home looking exhausted. Melissa had canceled another date because of work. "You want to order pizza?" I asked. He smiled. Honestly? Yeah. It felt like old times. We ate on the couch, made fun of a terrible action movie, laughed until soda came out of Edward's nose. "I hate you," he said while wiping his face. "You laughed first." "Shut up." For the first time in weeks, everything felt normal, until his phone buzzed. Melissa. He answered immediately. No, nothing. Just hanging out. His smile slowly disappeared. What? No. Another pause. I said nothing's going on. I quietly grabbed our empty pizza box and walked into the kitchen, trying not to listen. 5 minutes later, he came in looking frustrated. You okay? He rubbed his forehead. Melissa thinks I'm choosing you over her. What? I told her we were watching a movie. I blinked. And? And apparently that's weird. I tried to laugh. Because roommates never watch Netflix? He didn't laugh back. She thinks we're too attached. The words stung more than they should have. So what did you tell her? He looked uncomfortable. I told her she's overthinking. Good. But, I hated that word immediately. But maybe we do spend a lot of time together? I stared at him. What does that even mean? I don't know. You just said we're roommates. I know. Then what's the problem? Edward sighed. I just don't want this becoming a bigger issue. I nodded slowly. Got it. Neither of us realized that conversation was the beginning of the end. Over the next month, things became awkward. We still lived together, still shared bills, still talked, but something had shifted, like we were both carefully avoiding stepping on invisible cracks. Then, one Friday night, I came home early from work. Melissa's shoes were by the door. I wasn't planning to interrupt, so I quietly headed toward my bedroom. As I walked past the living room, I heard my own name. I just think Spencer depends on you too much. I froze. Edward answered quietly, That's not fair. It is fair. No, it isn't. You always put him first. There was another silence. Then Edward said something that hit me harder than anything else ever could. I'll figure something out. I stood there for a second. Then I grabbed my keys, walked back outside, and drove around for almost 3 hours because I suddenly didn't feel like going home. I had no idea that before the week was over, I'd be packing every box I owned. I spent the next few days pretending nothing had happened. Edward acted normal. I acted normal. Neither of us brought up what I'd overheard. But once you hear your best friend say, I'll figure something out, after someone complains about you, it's impossible to forget. I started staying later at work. Sometimes I'd sit in my car outside the apartment building for 20 minutes before going upstairs. Not because I didn't want to be home, because I didn't know what home felt like anymore. One Tuesday evening, I unlocked the apartment door and immediately knew Melissa was there. Her laugh carried from the kitchen. Edward looked up when I walked in. Oh, hey. Hey. Melissa smiled politely. Hi, Spencer. Hi. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and started heading toward my room. Actually, Edward said. I stopped. You got a minute? Something about his voice made my stomach tighten. Sure. Melissa looked down at the kitchen counter. Edward rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since college whenever he was nervous. We've been talking. I almost laughed. Those 4 words never led anywhere good. About? He took a breath. I think maybe it's time we stop living together. I just looked at him, not angry, not shocked, just empty. I mean, he continued quickly, our lease is almost up anyway. Right. And Melissa's apartment is closer to her job. Okay. And he couldn't finish the sentence. I nodded once. So, you've already decided? It's not like that. It kind of is. Melissa finally spoke. We're not trying to hurt you. I looked at her. I wasn't talking to you? The room went silent. Edward sighed. Spencer. No, it's okay. I surprised myself by smiling. A calm, tired smile. I get it. He looked relieved for about half a second before realizing that somehow made things worse. You've been my best friend for years, I said quietly. If living with me is becoming a problem, I shrugged. Then I'll move. You don't have to leave immediately. I know. But I will. That night I packed until almost 3 a.m, not because I had to, because if I stopped moving, I knew I'd start thinking. The hardest thing wasn't boxing up my clothes, it wasn't taking down pictures, it wasn't wrapping dishes in newspaper, it was finding all the tiny reminders of our life together. The ridiculous mug Edward bought me because it said, "Professional Overthinker." The deck of cards we'd never finished using, a faded movie ticket from 3 years earlier, a grocery list written entirely in terrible drawings because we'd challenged ourselves not to use words. Every box felt heavier than it should have. Around midnight, there was a knock on my bedroom door. You awake? Edward? Yeah. He opened the door a little. The room was filled with cardboard boxes. His face fell. You packed everything. I figured I'd get a head start. He stepped inside. I didn't mean for this to happen. I kept folding shirts. I know. No, seriously. I know. You don't believe me. I looked up. What am I supposed to believe? He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up an old framed picture from my desk. The two of us standing in front of the beach we'd driven 6 hours to see. We were sunburned, holding terrible gas station sunglasses, looking happier than either of us realized at the time. I don't want to lose this. He held up the photo. You're not. You know what I mean. I did. But I also knew something he didn't. I'd already lost him. Just not officially yet. I think we'll be okay. I lied. He stared at me for a long moment, then quietly placed the picture back on the desk. If you need help moving, I'll manage. He nodded once. Okay. That was probably the saddest conversation we'd ever had. A week later, I moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't much. The windows rattled every time a truck drove past. The shower only had 2 temperatures, freezing and lava. But it was mine. For the first month, Edward texted almost every day. How's the apartment? Found any decent restaurants yet? You still alive? I answered. Short replies. Friendly. Nothing more. Then the messages became less frequent. Life kept moving. He got more serious with Melissa. I buried myself in work. Months slipped by. Eventually, our conversations became birthday texts and random memes. That's what hurt the most. We hadn't fought. Nobody cheated anyone. Nobody betrayed anyone. We just drifted. Sometimes that's even worse. 8 months later, my phone rang. Edward. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Hey. Hey. His voice sounded different. Tired. You busy? Just got home. You got a minute? I leaned against my kitchen counter. Sure. There was a long pause. Melissa and I broke up. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry. Yeah. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked, You okay? He laughed quietly. Not really. That answer sounded more like the Edward I remembered. What happened? We wanted different things. I knew there was more to it, but I didn't push. Instead, we talked for almost 2 hours about work, about life, about stupid coworkers, about everything except the breakup. By the time we hung up, it felt strangely familiar, like we'd accidentally found the rhythm we'd lost. Over the next few weeks, we started talking again. Not every day, but enough. Coffee on Saturdays, basketball games, helping each other with random errands. Slowly, my best friend came back. At least, that's what I thought. Then one rainy Thursday evening, he called while I was making dinner. "Spencer? What's up? I need a favor." I smiled. "There it is." "What?" I knew this phone call had a catch. He laughed. "I deserve that." "So?" "My landlord sold the building." "Seriously?" "Yeah." "When do you have to move?" "End of the month." "Damn. I've been looking everywhere." "No luck?" "Everything's either outrageously expensive or terrible." I stirred the pasta on the stove. "That's rough." "It is." He went quiet again. I recognized that silence immediately. Whenever Edward had something difficult to ask, he always hesitated. Finally he spoke. "So? Yeah? Would you ever consider?" He stopped. "What?" Another deep breath. "Would you be my roommate again?" The spoon slipped out of my hand and clattered against the pot. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I'd imagined hearing it, because after everything we'd been through, I never thought those words would come out of his mouth again. For several seconds, I couldn't answer. I turned the stove off, leaned against the counter, and stared out the rain-covered kitchen window. Edward waited. "I know it's a lot to ask," he finally said. "You think?" He sighed. "I wouldn't ask if I had another option." I closed my eyes. "Edward." "Yeah?" "Last time we lived together." "I know." "You asked me to move out." "I know." "Now you're asking me to move back in." "I know." He sounded genuinely miserable. "I'm not pretending that didn't happen, Spencer." "Then why?" His answer came so quickly that I knew he'd already rehearsed it. "Because I miss having my best friend around." That sentence hit harder than I wanted it to. "I've missed you every day since you left." I swallowed. That's not exactly how it felt. "I know." "I thought you chose Melissa." "I did." His honesty caught me completely off guard. There wasn't a single excuse in his voice. "I chose the relationship because I thought that's what I was supposed to do." He paused. "I didn't realize I was slowly pushing away the person who'd been there for me long before she ever was." I stayed quiet. "I screwed up." More silence. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything." "No, it doesn't. But I am sorry." For the first time since he'd called, I believed every word. "When do you need an answer?" "This weekend." "I'll think about it." That's all I'm asking. I barely slept that night. Every logical part of my brain screamed the same thing. Don't do it. People don't make the same mistake twice, especially when the first one nearly broke them. But every emotional part of me remembered something else. Edward wasn't just an old roommate. He was still the person who knew I hated mushrooms, who remembered my coffee order without asking, who texted me every birthday at exactly midnight because he wanted to be the first, who once drove 2 hours in the middle of the night because my car broke down. Friendships like that don't disappear. They just get damaged. The question was, could ours actually be repaired? Saturday morning, I met him for coffee. The same little cafe we'd gone to for years. He was already sitting outside. When he saw me, he stood up immediately. "You came." "You sounded surprised." "I kind of was." He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes. His hair was a mess. He hadn't shaved in days. Breakups looked different on everyone. On Edward, they looked heavy. We ordered coffee and sat in silence for a minute. Finally, I asked, "You really want another roommate?" "I really want you." The words came out so naturally that neither of us noticed them at first. Edward blinked. "I mean," he rubbed his face. "You specifically." I couldn't help smiling. Not helping. "I know." He laughed awkwardly. "I'm making this worse." "You kind of are." We both laughed. The tension eased a little. Then he became serious again. I've looked at 4 apartments. Okay. Every time I imagined living there, he shrugged. It just felt empty. I stirred my coffee. You're making this sound emotional. It is emotional. You never used to admit that. I'm trying something new. That actually sounded like growth. He leaned forward. I don't miss having a roommate. He looked directly at me. I miss having you around. My chest tightened. I looked away before he could notice. What if things end the same way? They won't. You can't promise that. No. He nodded. I can't. His honesty made it difficult to stay guarded. But I can promise this. What? If something bothers me, I'll tell you. No guessing. No avoiding conversations. No letting somebody else decide our friendship. That last sentence lingered between us. You really mean that? I do. I believed him. That scared me. He insisted I come look at one apartment before deciding. It'll help. I don't see how. You'll see. The building was newer than either of our old places. Large windows, a gym downstairs, walking distance from both our jobs. The apartment itself was surprisingly nice. 2 bedrooms, big kitchen, balcony overlooking a small park. I walked slowly through the living room. It's actually great. I know. Edward smiled for the first time all morning. I figured you'd like the natural light. You remembered. You always complain about dark apartments. I laughed. I do. He looked almost relieved that I'd laughed at all. We wandered through the empty rooms. The silence felt strangely comfortable, almost familiar. Then we stepped onto the balcony. Rain had finally stopped. The city looked fresh. Cars hissed across wet streets below. Edward leaned against the railing. You know? What? I kept expecting you to hate this place. Why? Because then saying no would be easier. I looked at him. I haven't said yes? I know. But you haven't said no either. Fair point. You've changed. He smiled faintly. I had to? What happened? He looked out over the park. When you moved out? His voice became quieter. I realized something. I waited. I'd spent years assuming you'd always be there. The sentence landed harder than anything else he'd said. I never appreciated what we had until I lost it. He laughed bitterly. Pretty cliché. A little. But true. I nodded slowly. I was angry. I know. I thought I wasn't important anymore. You were. It didn't feel like it. I know. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then Edward surprised me. I kept wanting to call. Why didn't you? I figured you hated me. I laughed softly. I was trying really hard to. Did it work? I looked at him. No. He smiled. Good. As we walked back through the apartment, he stopped outside what would be my bedroom. If, he corrected himself, if you said yes? Yeah? I'd really like another chance? I studied his face. No pressure, no manipulation, just hope. For the first time in almost a year, I realized I wanted another chance too. I just wasn't sure if my heart was ready to trust him again. Then, just as we reached the front door, Edward's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly. What? He hesitated. It's Melissa. The air between us suddenly felt a lot colder. Edward stared at his phone for a couple of seconds before locking the screen again. He didn't answer. You don't have to ignore it because I'm here, I said. I'm not. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. I just don't want to. I raised an eyebrow. That's surprisingly mature. I've been working on that. We walked out of the building together, neither of us saying much. The conversation had already exhausted both of us. As we reached the parking lot, Edward finally spoke. She wants to get coffee. You should probably go. I don't know. Why not? He looked genuinely conflicted. Because every time we've tried talking since the breakup, it turns into another argument. Then maybe this one won't. He shook his head. You always see the best in people. I try. I miss that. I smiled a little. You say that a lot now. Because it's true. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked in months. I walked from room to room, trying to imagine leaving. Again, my lease ended in 3 weeks. Technically, the timing was perfect. Emotionally, not even close. My phone buzzed. Edward, thanks for today. A few seconds later, another message appeared. No pressure. Whatever you decide, I understand. I stared at the screen, then typed, How did coffee with Melissa go? The reply came almost immediately. I didn't go. I frowned. Why? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, because I realized I wasn't hoping we'd get back together. Another message. I was hoping you'd say yes. I read that text 3 times, then locked my phone without answering. Monday afternoon, my manager called me into his office. We're opening a new branch. Okay. We'd like you to supervise it? I blinked. Seriously? You've earned it. The promotion came with better pay, better hours, and a location, less than 10 minutes from the apartment Edward wanted. Life suddenly had perfect timing, which made me suspicious. That evening, I called him. He answered before the first ring finished. Spencer? I got promoted. What? I got the branch supervisor job. There was half a second of silence. Then, Dude, he actually shouted. I had to pull the phone away from my ear. I knew you'd get it. I didn't. I did. You've been saying that for 2 years. Because you've deserved it for 2 years. I laughed. You sound more excited than I am. I probably am. His happiness felt completely genuine, not forced, not polite, just Edward. After the excitement settled down, neither of us hung up. Any closer to deciding? I leaned back in my chair. Come help me pack this weekend. What? My apartment. Another pause. Are you? I'm saying yes. He didn't say anything. Edward? His voice cracked. I wasn't expecting you to actually say it. You literally asked. I know. But, he laughed quietly, I'm really glad you did. So am I. And for the first time in almost a year, I meant it. Moving day felt strangely familiar. We rented another truck, argued over how to stack furniture, realized neither of us had remembered to buy packing tape. Again, some things never changed. You still overpack books? Edward grunted as he lifted one of my boxes. You still underestimate how heavy books are? I forgot you own a library. I like reading. You like collecting. That's also true. By noon, we were sweaty, exhausted, and surviving entirely on drive-thru burgers. As we carried the last box upstairs, Edward suddenly stopped outside the apartment door. What? He looked at me. I've been thinking. That sounds dangerous. He rolled his eyes. I'm serious. So am I. He smiled. I don't want us pretending last year never happened. I wasn't planning to. If I do something stupid, I'll tell you. If something bothers you, I'll tell you. No more pretending we're fine? No more pretending. He held out his fist. I stared at it. What are we, 12? Probably. I laughed and bumped his fist anyway. Deal. Living together again felt surprisingly easy, not identical, just easier than either of us expected. We had both changed. We communicated more. If one of us had a bad day, we actually said it. If something annoyed us, we talked instead of letting it grow. Within a few weeks, the apartment already felt like home. Friday movie nights returned, Sunday grocery trips, cooking disasters. Edward somehow still couldn't make rice without burning it. I followed the instructions. The smoke detector disagrees. It betrayed me. The rice betrayed itself. We laughed so hard, that night we ended up ordering takeout instead. It reminded me of college, only better, more honest, more grown up. One Friday evening, we were putting together a cheap bookshelf we'd ordered online. Edward was reading the instructions upside down. I don't think this piece goes there. It definitely does. It definitely doesn't. 5 minutes later, the entire shelf collapsed onto the floor. I crossed my arms. You were saying? He sighed dramatically. I hate being wrong. No. You enjoy watching me be wrong. Also true. He threw one of the instruction booklets at me. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the couch. When I looked back at him, he was already looking at me. Not laughing anymore, just watching. What? He blinked. You were staring. I was? Yeah. He looked away almost immediately. Sorry. I frowned. Everything okay? Yeah. He stood up. I'm gonna grab us drinks. Something about that moment stayed with me. Not because he'd looked at me, because of the expression on his face. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It almost looked fond. I told myself I was imagining things, because imagining anything else would only lead somewhere dangerous. I'd already made that mistake once. I wasn't about to make it again. But later that night, as we sat on the balcony talking about absolutely nothing, I caught him looking at me again. And this time, he didn't look away first. I should have looked away. Instead, I held his gaze. The city lights reflected in the windows across the street, and for a few quiet seconds, neither of us said anything. Edward was the first to break the silence. What? I smiled. You've been asking me that a lot lately. He looked confused. No, I mean, why are you looking at me like that? I could ask you the same thing. A faint smile appeared on his face before he leaned back in his chair. Fair enough. The conversation drifted somewhere else after that, but the moment stayed with me. It was subtle, almost impossible to explain. Yet something between us had changed, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. The following week was busy. My promotion meant longer hours, and Edward had started freelancing after work to save extra money. Most evenings, we barely crossed paths until dinner. Still, we always found time to sit together for at least a few minutes. Sometimes we'd eat in front of the TV. Sometimes we'd stand in the kitchen talking while washing dishes. Sometimes we'd end up on the balcony until midnight. It felt easy, like we'd finally grown into the friendship we'd always wanted. One Thursday evening, I came home carrying 2 grocery bags. Edward was already cooking. The apartment smelled like garlic and onions. Please tell me that's not another attempt at your famous pasta. He looked offended. My pasta is excellent. Your smoke alarm has a different opinion? It only happened twice? 4 times. You're exaggerating. I laughed. I replaced the batteries twice because of you. He pointed the wooden spoon at me. You're eating it anyway. I always do. You secretly like my cooking. I secretly like surviving. He rolled his eyes. I missed this. The words came out quietly, without thinking. I looked up from unpacking the groceries. What? He shrugged. Just this. He waved the spoon around the apartment. Coming home and knowing somebody's here. I smiled. I missed it too. His expression softened. I wasn't sure you'd ever forgive me. I'm still working on that. I know. And you're making progress. He grinned. I'll take it. A few days later, we decided to host a game night. Nothing big, just a few friends from work. The apartment filled with laughter, pizza boxes, and way too many card games. At one point, one of Edward's coworkers, Lena, looked between us and smiled. Edward looked up. How long have you two been together? The room went completely silent. I nearly choked on my drink. Edward blinked. What? As roommates? She clarified quickly. Another coworker laughed. No, I definitely thought they were dating. I did too. So did I. I looked down at the table, trying not to smile. This wasn't new. People had been making that assumption for years. Edward laughed awkwardly. Nope. Just best friends. Lena narrowed her eyes. You finish each other's sentences. We've known each other forever. You also keep looking at each other. Neither of us answered. She looked suspiciously pleased with herself. I'm just saying. There's nothing to say, Edward replied. She raised both hands. Fine. But she kept smiling. After everyone left, we cleaned the apartment together. Edward was unusually quiet. Finally, I asked, You okay? Yeah. You've said 3 words in 10 minutes. I'm thinking. About? He rinsed another plate. Do people really think we're a couple? I laughed. You've seriously never noticed? I thought it was just college. No. It still happens? Pretty regularly. He leaned against the counter. Huh? I never really thought about it. I dried another plate. Does it bother you? He didn't answer immediately. Then, no. That surprised me. It used to? He looked thoughtful. I think I cared too much about what other people assumed. And now? He shrugged. I know who I am. The answer sounded simple, but something about it lingered in my mind. The next Saturday morning, Edward knocked on my bedroom door. You awake? Barely. Get dressed. Why? We're going somewhere. Where? It's a surprise. I groaned. I hate surprises. I know. That's exactly why you're smiling. Correct. 40 minutes later, we were driving out of the city. I looked over. Are you going to tell me? No. Not even a hint? Nope. After another 20 minutes, he turned onto a familiar road. I recognized it instantly. No way. He smiled. You know where we are. The lake. 3 years earlier, we'd taken a weekend trip there with friends. It had become one of my favorite memories. I figured we could use a day off. We parked near the water and started walking. The weather was perfect. Cool breeze, bright sun, families scattered across the shoreline. For the first hour, we talked about everything except serious life, work, sports, terrible movies. At one point, Edward skipped a flat stone across the lake. It bounced 7 times. Still got it. I hate you. You sound jealous? I am jealous. He laughed. That laugh. I'd missed it more than I ever admitted. Eventually, we found a quiet bench overlooking the water. Neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward, just peaceful. Edward rested his elbows on his knees. Can I ask you something? Sure. When you moved out last year? His voice slowed. Did you think we'd ever be friends again? I answered honestly. No. He nodded. I didn't either. Another long silence. I blamed myself every day. You should have blamed yourself a little. I did. I know. I deserved it. I looked over at him. You also grew. He smiled sadly. I had to. Then he turned toward me. Spencer. There was something different in his voice, more serious than usual. I need to tell you something. My stomach tightened. What is it? He opened his mouth. Before he could say another word, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It's my mom. You should answer. He hesitated, then picked up. I watched his expression change almost immediately. His smile disappeared. What? A pause. When? Another pause. I'll be there. He ended the call slowly. I stood up. Edward? He looked at me, visibly shaken. My dad's in the hospital. Without another word, we ran back toward the car. The drive to the hospital felt twice as long as it actually was. Edward gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't anything to say. Every few minutes he'd glance at his phone, hoping for another update. Nothing. I had known his parents almost as long as I'd known him. His dad, Michael, had always treated me like family. He was the kind of man who'd insist on grilling enough food for 20 people when only 6 were coming over. He remembered birthdays, asked about work, always ended every conversation with, "Take care of yourself, Spencer." Seeing Edward this worried made my own stomach knot. You okay? I asked quietly. He gave a tiny shake of his head. I'm scared. It was probably the most vulnerable sentence I'd ever heard him say. I know. I should have visited more? Don't do that to yourself. I kept saying I'd go next weekend. His voice cracked. There's always another weekend, until there isn't. I reached across the center console and rested my hand on his forearm. You don't know anything yet. He looked down at my hand for a second, then nodded. Thanks. I didn't move it until we pulled into the hospital parking lot. After checking in, we found his mother sitting outside the emergency department. She stood up the moment she saw Edward and wrapped him in a hug. Oh, sweetheart. What happened? He collapsed at work. Is he? They stabilized him. Edward let out a shaky breath. The doctors think it was his heart. For the first time since we'd arrived, I felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He asked about you, his mom said. And she looked over at me and smiled warmly. He asked if Spencer came too. I couldn't help smiling. I'm here. She hugged me just as tightly. I knew you would be. Edward looked at me for a brief second. There was gratitude in his eyes, the kind that didn't need words. A few hours later, the doctors finally allowed us to see Michael. He looked tired, paler than usual, but when he spotted us, he smiled. Well, his voice was raspy. Look who finally showed up. Edward laughed through watery eyes. You scared us. I know. You really know how to ruin a Saturday. Michael chuckled. I figured if I was going to have a heart attack. He looked at me. I'd better make sure you two started hanging out again. Edward rolled his eyes. Dad. What? You've barely spoken in months. Michael looked between us. Looks fixed to me. Neither of us answered, because he wasn't entirely wrong. Michael remained in the hospital for several days. Edward spent every evening there after work. So did I. Not because anyone asked, because it felt natural. One night, while Edward had gone downstairs to grab coffee, Michael motioned for me to come closer. I need to ask you something. Sure. You living together again? I smiled. Yeah. Good. He nodded slowly. He smiles more. I looked toward the hallway where Edward had disappeared. So do you? I laughed. I guess. Michael studied me for a long moment. You've always been good for him. My chest tightened. I just try to be a good friend. I know. Another quiet pause. Don't let each other drift apart again. I don't think we will. I hope not. He smiled. Life's too short. Those words stayed with me long after we left the room. A week later, Michael was discharged. The doctors expected a full recovery, as long as he took things slower. Edward looked lighter than he had in days. That Friday evening, we ordered takeout and collapsed onto the couch. Neither of us had enough energy to cook. I don't think I've ever been that scared, he admitted. I could tell. I kept thinking. He stopped. What? If something had happened to him. He stared down at his hands. I'd regret wasting so much time. I nodded. I've been thinking about that too. He looked at me. I wasted almost a year. You can't change that. I know. But I can stop wasting more. The room became very quiet. He turned off the television. Spencer. There it was again, that serious tone. I was trying to tell you something at the lake. I remember. He inhaled slowly. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks. You can just say it? I know. But I'm terrified. I blinked. Terrified? He laughed nervously, which is really inconvenient. I smiled. You've got my attention. He looked directly into my eyes. When we stopped living together, I thought I only missed my best friend. He swallowed. But after we moved back in, his voice grew quieter. I realized I was looking forward to every morning because you'd be there. My heartbeat quickened. I looked forward to dinner because you'd be sitting across from me. He gave a small, nervous laugh. I started making excuses just to spend more time with you. I couldn't say anything. I kept telling myself it was because we'd fixed our friendship. He shook his head. It wasn't just that. The silence between us felt impossibly fragile. Then he whispered, I think I fell in love with you. Everything inside me stopped. He looked away immediately. I know that's a lot. I know I might have completely misunderstood my feelings. I know you might not feel the same. His voice trembled. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. For several seconds, neither of us moved. He started to stand. I'm sorry. Before he could take a single step, I reached out and caught his wrist. He turned back. His eyes were full of uncertainty. I smiled, a small, shaky smile. You idiot. He frowned. What? I've been in love with you since we were roommates the first time. His eyes widened. What? I just never told you. I thought you were straight. I thought I was. He actually laughed in disbelief. So we've both been complete idiots? For years. He covered his face with one hand. We really have. I stood up. What happens now? Edward looked at me for a long moment. Then, very carefully, he stepped closer. He smiled nervously. Would it be okay if I kissed my roommate? For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Edward stood in front of me, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't joking. He was waiting. Spencer? I laughed softly. You're asking for permission? He nodded. I don't want to assume anything. That was so completely Edward that my heart somehow managed to melt even more. You've always been an overthinker. I learned from the best. I stepped a little closer. You can stop asking. He searched my face one last time. Are you sure? Instead of answering, I closed the small distance between us. The kiss was gentle, careful, almost hesitant. It lasted only a few seconds before we both pulled back. Edward blinked at me. Wow. I laughed. That's your reaction? I had a better speech planned. What happened to it? You kissed me. So? I forgot every word. I couldn't stop smiling. So did I. For the first time in years, there wasn't a single unanswered question between us. No guessing, no wondering, no pretending. Just relief. The next morning felt strangely normal. Almost suspiciously normal. Edward was already making coffee when I walked into the kitchen. He looked over. Morning. Morning. We both froze, then started laughing. What? I asked. I don't know how we're supposed to act. You've known me for almost 10 years. I know. And yesterday, you kissed me. I also know. So, I reached for my coffee mug. Maybe we just keep being us? He thought about it. I'd like that. So would I. He handed me my coffee exactly the way I liked it. 1 sugar, just enough cream. He hadn't even asked. Some habits never changed. A week later, Edward's parents invited us over for dinner to celebrate Michael being back on his feet. The drive there was much quieter than usual. You nervous? I asked. A little? Because of your dad? Edward glanced at me. No. I immediately understood. They don't know. They know we're roommates. They know we're best friends. He smiled faintly. They don't know we figured out we were idiots? I laughed. That's one way to describe it. As soon as we walked through the front door, Michael looked up from the living room. There they are. He pointed at us dramatically. My favorite troublemakers. His wife rolled her eyes. You say that every time. Because it's true. Dinner felt exactly like it always had. Michael told the same stories. Edward's mom insisted everyone take seconds. We laughed far too much. For a while, I almost forgot anything had changed. Then, as everyone helped clear the table, Michael motioned for Edward and me to stay behind. I've got a question. Edward looked worried. What? Michael folded his arms. So, he looked between us. You finally going to tell us? Edward blinked. Tell you what? Michael sighed dramatically. Son, you've looked at Spencer the same way since you were 23. Edward nearly dropped the plate he was holding. His mother smiled into her tea. I told you he'd notice eventually. I stared at both of them. You... His mom laughed. Oh, sweetheart. We've known for years. Edward looked completely speechless. But, Michael pointed toward him, when you brought girlfriends over, then he pointed at me. You spent more time talking to Spencer than to them. Edward opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His mom continued. And every family barbecue? She smiled warmly. The first person you looked for wasn't us. It was each other. I felt my face getting warm. Michael leaned back in his chair. So? He grinned. Are we finally allowed to stop pretending? Edward slowly looked at me, then back at his parents. He smiled. Together. His mother stood up immediately and hugged both of us. It's about time. Michael laughed so hard he started coughing. I told you. His wife handed him a glass of water. You also said they'd need another 5 years. I was close. You weren't. The whole room filled with laughter, and somehow, instead of feeling awkward, it felt like coming home. The weeks that followed were surprisingly easy. We decided not to rush anything. We were already sharing an apartment, already sharing routines, already sharing our lives. The only difference was that now we didn't have to hide how much we cared about each other. Friday movie nights became actual date nights. Morning coffee somehow tasted better. Even grocery shopping became something we looked forward to. One afternoon, While we were arguing over which cereal to buy, Lena, the coworker from game night, walked past us. She stopped, looked at our shopping cart, looked at us holding hands, then burst out laughing. "I knew it," Edward groaned. "Please don't." "I absolutely will." She pointed at both of us. "I've been waiting months for this." "You were right," I admitted. "I know." She looked incredibly pleased with herself. "I expect a thank you card." Edward shook his head. "You're impossible." "I've been told." A few months later, on the anniversary of the day we'd moved back in together, we sat on the apartment balcony watching the sunset, the same balcony where I'd caught him staring at me. Edward rested his elbow on the railing. "You know?" "What?" "I almost never asked." I turned toward him. "Asked what?" "You to move back in?" "Why?" "I thought you'd say no." "I almost did." He smiled. "I'm really glad you didn't." "So am I." He reached over and intertwined his fingers with mine. "If I hadn't taken that chance," he looked out across the park, "I'd still be wondering what would have happened." I squeezed his hand. "And now?" He smiled. "Now I know." I looked around the apartment we'd rebuilt together, the place that had once been our second chance. Now it was something even better. It was our home. There was only one chapter left to write. 6 months later, life had settled into a rhythm that somehow still surprised me. Every morning, Edward was up before me. Every single morning. He'd make coffee, complain about the news while scrolling through his phone, and pretend not to notice that I always stole the first sip from his mug before pouring my own. "You know you have your own cup." "I know." "So why are you drinking mine?" "It tastes better." "It's the exact same coffee." "It has emotional flavor." He stared at me. "I have absolutely no response to that." "I know." He kissed the top of my head before leaving for work. It was such a small gesture, but every time he did it, I caught myself smiling like an idiot. Our friends adjusted surprisingly quickly. Actually, most of them acted like nothing had changed. One Friday, we met everyone for dinner. Halfway through the meal, one of our college friends looked around the table. He pointed at Edward. "You finally admitted it?" Edward frowned. "Admitted what?" "That you've been in love with Spencer for years." I nearly laughed into my drink. Edward looked horrified. "What is happening?" Our friend shrugged. "Dude, you literally skipped a camping trip because Spencer had the flu." "I was being a good friend." "You drove across the state to help him move one bookshelf." "It was a heavy bookshelf." "You remembered his coffee order before you remembered your own." Edward opened his mouth, closed it again. The entire table burst into laughter. I leaned over and whispered, "I don't think you were fooling anyone." He sighed dramatically. "I've been surrounded by detectives." "No," I smiled. "You've been surrounded by people who knew you better than you knew yourself." He couldn't even argue with that. A few weeks later, Michael invited us over to help him rebuild the old deck behind the house. The doctor had finally cleared him for light work. Edward handed his dad a drill. "You sure you should be doing this?" Michael rolled his eyes. "If I sit inside all day, your mother will start giving me chores." "You already have chores." "Exactly." By lunchtime, the new deck was halfway finished. Edward's mom brought sandwiches outside. As everyone settled down, Michael looked at me. "So, Spencer?" "Yeah?" "When are you making an honest man out of my son?" Edward almost dropped his sandwich. "Dad." "What?" "We've been dating for 6 months." "So? So maybe slow down?" Michael shrugged. "I'm retired. I've got time." His mom laughed. "Ignore him." "You know." Michael took another bite of his sandwich. I've been waiting to embarrass him with that joke for years. Edward buried his face in his hands. I can't believe this. I smiled. I kinda can. That night, after we got home, Edward flopped onto the couch. My family is impossible. They love you? I know. They love you too? I know. He looked at me thoughtfully. You fit? With your family? Yeah. I always have. He nodded. Exactly. The realization hit both of us at the same time. Nothing had really changed. I'd been part of his family for years. The only difference was that now nobody had to pretend there wasn't something more between us. A month later, we found ourselves back at the same lake where everything had almost changed. This time, there wasn't an interrupted conversation, no emergency phone calls, no fear hanging over either of us. Just the two of us walking along the shoreline. Edward skipped another stone, only 4 bounces. I've lost my touch. You're getting old. I'm 3 months older than you. Exactly. He laughed. You'll never let that go. Never. We reached the same bench where he'd almost confessed months earlier. This is where I panicked, he said. I remember. I had this whole speech planned. And? It was terrible. I'm sure it wasn't. It really was. I nudged his shoulder. I would have listened anyway. He smiled softly. I know. After a quiet moment, he reached into his jacket pocket. My heart skipped. Then he pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I stared at him. Seriously? What? I thought. He laughed so hard he had to sit down. You thought I was proposing? You reached into your pocket. I know. He was still laughing. I can't believe your face. I shoved his shoulder. You're unbelievable. He unfolded the paper. I found this while cleaning. It was old, creased, faded. I recognized it instantly. Our grocery list. The one with all the terrible drawings? He grinned. You kept it? You kept it. We both laughed. Looking at the page, I could still make out the terrible sketches. Milk, bread, eggs, coffee. None of them looked remotely recognizable. You were a terrible artist? So were you. I know. He folded the paper carefully. It's funny. What is? We spent years thinking the important moments were the big ones. I looked at him. But when I think about us, he smiled. I remember grocery lists, late night takeout, burnt rice, movie nights, coffee every morning. I nodded. Home? Yeah. He squeezed my hand. Home. On the anniversary of the day we first became roommates years ago, we carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the balcony. The park below was waking up, people walking dogs, kids riding bikes. The same view we'd shared through heartbreak, forgiveness, friendship, and finally love. Edward leaned against the railing. You know what my biggest fear used to be? What? That asking you to move back in would ruin whatever friendship we had left. And instead, he smiled at me. It gave me my best friend back. I smiled. And a little more. And a lot more. We stood there in comfortable silence. No dramatic speeches, no perfect movie ending. Just 2 people who had finally stopped running from what had been right in front of them for years. Sometimes love doesn't begin with fireworks. Sometimes it begins with forgiveness, with a second chance. With one simple question asked at exactly the right time. Would you be my roommate again? Looking back, I realized that wasn't really what Edward had been asking. What he was really asking was whether we could build a life together one more time. And every morning I woke up beside the man who had once been just my best friend. I was grateful that I'd answered with one simple word. Yes.